Hello and welcome back. In this video we're going to talk about the basic processing steps that we need to apply to our images in Lightroom or Camera Raw before we take it into Photoshop for further processing and refinement. And when we talk about processing our files in Lightroom, it's important to remember that we're adjusting the parameters around the data that's been captured by the camera. And it's always preferable to adjust the raw data before you turn it into an RGB pixel-based image in Photoshop. And in this guide I'm going to talk about 8 basic steps and a further 6 optional steps that you would need to apply, or at least need to look at, for every image before you decide whether it's worthwhile taking it further into a full-blown image in Photoshop and spending a lot more time on it. And using these tools, you should be able to do a basic assessment of your image within about 60 seconds. So let's have a look at the first steps. And the first steps we're going to have a look at are the really basic ones that we need to do before we start to look at anything else. And it's important to remember that it doesn't really matter which order you do these in, although Adobe tends to try and steer you towards the order in which they appear in the development panel in Lightroom or Camera Raw. But in reality it doesn't really matter. But there is a little bit of logic in how we go about this. And the first step we would do would be to go to the crop tool and decide whether there are any parts of the image that we want to get rid of, particularly if there are bright areas around the edge of the image that might affect our overall assessment of exposure. And we do that by selecting the crop tool and then using the tools to change the size of the image. And you don't have to, of course, maintain the original parameters and aspect ratios. In this instance, I'm happy with the overall composition of this image, so I'm not going to make any changes, but that's something that you would look at first up. And the second thing we then look at is to set the overall tonality of the image, and we do that not by using the exposure tool, we'll come back to that later, but to set the black point and the white point. In this image here, in this example, it was taken in the rainforest area in Western Tasmania on an overcast day, but even so, the brighter areas of the waterfall really tended to blow out, so I've had to adjust the exposure in the field so that my white areas of the image were not overblown, so we didn't lose detail. But of course the foreground is a little bit dark, and this is typical for a lot of landscape images. When you have a difference in brightness level between the foreground and the sky, or the foreground and other elements, often you'll have a tonal range that's going to be problematic, and so this is why we need to make these adjustments. The first thing we would do would be to set the black point, and that we do that simply by clicking on the slider on the blacks area. And if you look at the histogram when we do this, you'll see that the histogram highlights the very darkest areas of the image. And to get an idea, rather than use the little tool here to show clipping, there's a very simple way we can just use this by hitting the Alt key when we get onto the slider, and we get an active mask over the image, and you can see there that I have a few areas clipped to black, and in a lot of images we would expect to see some areas that are black, and I'm just going to adjust that very slightly so that I have a minimal area of black in the image, and you'll see that I've not really moved it very much. And the second one is to make sure that my whites are not clipped, and in fact I have a little bit of headroom there, so if we go to the whites slider, hold down our Alt key again, I can move that slider a little bit more to the right until I start to see clipping, and you'll see as I move in towards the right hand side, more and more of the image becomes clipped, as you can see with the mask, and so we'll bring that back so that we're not actually getting any clipping. And again, I've made a fairly minor adjustment. And the next thing that we would do, we would set the overall mid-tone balance using what Adobe called the exposure slider, but in fact it is the mid-tones. If we hover on the little slider here, you'll see in the histogram above that we're targeting the mid-tones of the image. Why Adobe call it exposure and not mid-tones is a bit of a mystery, but nonetheless it's the mid-tones that once we've set the black and white points, moving the mid-tones you'll see doesn't really affect the black and white points much at all. If we go excessively, of course, you will start to push the image way beyond its capabilities, but minor adjustments will target the middle tones of the image. So I wanted to lighten up some of those shadow areas so that we can see some of the lovely detail in here. And so I've pushed the mid-tones up quite a bit, and you'll see now that I've actually, by doing that, I've pushed the whites up a little bit, so I'll just bring that back so that we don't have any clipping. And in doing our adjustments, we will find that we have to do a little bit of a change here and there once we've changed some of the other areas of the image. And we can just fix that up quite simply. So the first three adjustments we make is setting the black point, the white point, and the mid-tone balance using the exposure slider. And then once we have the overall tonality of the image somewhere where we want it, now is the time that we can look at the color temperature. And the reason we don't look at the color temperature initially is that our eyes are much more sensitive to tonal range and to brightness in an image than to the color temperature. So if the image needs tonal adjustment, do that first, then look at the color temperature. And there's a couple of ways we can adjust this. We could just rely on the as shot white balance, the auto white balance that you may have selected on your camera, and that's generally not a bad starting point, although it can be thrown off by unusual lighting conditions. Or of course we can use the temperature probe to find an area of neutral tone that we can then use to assess our color balance. Now we don't want to go into the brightest part of the image. We want to pick something that is just a little bit off the brightest tone and then see how the color balance works. And by using this tool and moving it over into a part of that waterfall that's not completely the brightest area, we can see that overall the color balance isn't too bad, although there is a little bit of an excess of blue. So if I just click on that point now, it will change the white balance a little bit, and you'll see now that it's a little warmer. Or of course we could go to the presets and say, well, it was taken on a cloudy day. We can click on the cloudy preset and it's not a lot different. I think in fact I might even prefer the white balance from the color picker, and then we can get a real assessment of how the image looks. Okay, so now that we have the overall tonality of the image adjusted, and we've adjusted the white balance to give us a closely correct color balance, the next thing we can start to do is to look at the color intensity, and we do that by using the tools down here in the presence area. And this is just a quick way to get those initial steps done. And normally we would use vibrance rather than saturation, because vibrance is a little more subtle in its approach, and depending on your personal taste, if we went up to 100%, you'll see that the greens and the yellows in the image have gone completely psychotic and overblown. So obviously we don't go that far, but generally somewhere between 15 to 20 is a good starting point to give us an idea of how the colors should look in the image, and that's looking pretty good now. And so by adjusting our overall color intensity, we're starting to see the image how it will look when it's finally manipulated and adjusted to create our final image. And once we've done that, we can look at things like the clarity and texture. And to do that, let's just zoom in on the image a little closer. There was a little bit of movement in some of these parts of the image, so let's just have a look at an area where we haven't had movement. And firstly, texture brings out the fine detail in an image, and if I go all the way up to 100, you'll see that some of these very fine areas of detail start to come out. If I take it back to 0, you'll see in the waterfall it's a little bit soft, and as I increase the texture slider, you start to see more of that fine detail. But of course, if you go all the way to 100%, you start to bring out some excessive noise. So double click on the word texture to reset, and again somewhere 15 to 20 is a good starting point. And then we come down to clarity. Now clarity adjusts the contrast in the larger areas of tone. Again, if I take it all the way up to 100%, you'll see that the very dark areas have been made much darker and the lighter areas have been blown completely out. And you'll see up here in the histogram, I'm now getting more clipping. So obviously we don't want to do that with our clarity slider. So somewhere again 15 to 20 depending on your taste. And if we zoom back, we can see what happens if I reset clarity in this image. It just adds a little bit of mid-tone contrast, gives it a little bit more presence, the name implies, and we're well on the way to getting our image where it needs to be. So that's the first 7 steps. The 8th step that we would apply to all images is to apply some sharpening. And many people just seem to forget about this and do it later on in Photoshop, but it's important to do this here with the basic image parameters, and then we don't have to do excessive work in Photoshop. And when you open an image in Lightroom, by default with a later version of Lightroom, the sharpening value is set at 40. Now that's just a fairly arbitrary value that is determined by Lightroom, and it's by no means optimal. And if we took the slider all the way up, you'll see that if we went to maximum sharpening, you should be able to see on your screen some rather ugly luminance noise, and while it's brought out a lot of detail, it's by no means ideal. So let's just go back, and typically this is taken on a fairly high resolution camera. Somewhere around 50 to 60 value of sharpening is fine. We don't ever change the radius larger than 1 pixel. You can go less than 1 pixel, but generally 1 pixel is a good detail to stick to. And then we also have a detail slider which brings out the very fine detail, a little bit like the texture slider. And again, depending on the image, if it's a landscape image with a lot of very fine detail, you can certainly take that up to nearly 100% if you so desire. And you'll see if I take that back, there is a little bit of more fine detail coming out. And the last but most important part of applying the sharpening to your raw file is to mask it so that it's not sharpening areas where there are no detail. Again, if I hold down the Alt key and move the slider, we get an active mask overlay, and as we slide to the right, more and more parts of the image are showing in black, which means there is no sharpening applied. And generally I would zoom back to see the full image when I'm doing the masking, so I can get a good idea of where my masking is being applied. You'll see that in the bright areas of water there's no sharpening, and in some of those deep shadow areas there is no sharpening, but it's applied progressively in the other areas of the image. So that's adding the sharpening. And if we just come up to the top of the detail tab and click on this little switch here, you can turn all the sharpening off, and you'll see that the rest of the image looks quite soft, but when we apply an appropriate amount of sharpening, it adds that extra element to our image and brings out some of the fine detail. So these are the first 8 essential steps, and I've taken a little bit of time to go through these, but typically working through an image that you're deciding whether it's worthwhile pursuing, you can quickly go through those 8 steps. That gives you a really good idea of how the image is looking, and you should be able to do that in less than 60 seconds. And we'll next look at the other 6 optional steps that can add further refinement. Again, can be done rather quickly before you decide to spend a lot more time on an image. Having gone through those basic steps, the 8 initial steps, I should just point out that this is not meant to be a comprehensive workflow in Lightroom. This is just a quick start guide to get you to see what is in your image before you spend a bit more time refining and adjusting it to get the optimum result. This is all about a quick way to assess your images rather than just relying on the initial preview, which is by no means giving you an accurate idea of what's in the image. So having completed those 8 initial steps, and certainly when we looked at sharpening, I didn't mention anything about noise reduction, because that's an optional step that you may need to go into if you've used high ISO or long exposure or both. And of course noise reduction is the other side of the sharpening. So if you apply excessive sharpening on a high ISO image, you are going to need to look at the noise reduction. We'll cover that in a further video somewhere down the track, but again, as I mentioned, this is all about the quick start guide, getting a quick assessment of how your image is looking, and so you can then decide whether you want to invest a little more time to get it really refined and looking the best it possibly can be. So we looked at the 8 initial steps. We have a few further options that we would go through to further refine how the image looks, and we have things like the shadow adjustment, and we adjusted the overall exposure using the exposure guide or the midtones. The shadows works on the area immediately above the blacks. The blacks are the darkest tones in the image. The shadows are the next to the blacks and before the midtones. And you will often find that you need to give that midtone area a little bit of a boost, as I would here. And likewise with the highlights, which are the area immediately down from the whites in an image, you may need to manipulate that a little bit alongside the highlights and the whites so that we're not getting excessive clipping. But one thing you will find when you start to adjust the shadows and the highlights, you may lose a little bit of overall contrast in the image. And what we want to do is we want to maintain that contrast. So having adjusted the shadows and highlights, which is our 9th step, I would then go to the contrast and see whether in fact I need to add a little contrast. And one easy way to assess how these different sliders work is to just simply take them all the way up to the maximum and then come back. Obviously, value of 100 on the contrast is horrible, but increasing it just a little bit can help us just allay some of that softness that creeps in by lifting up the midtones, shadows and highlights. So just a little bit of added contrast can help. And one of the other things that we would optionally look at, and some people would do this as a matter of standard procedure, is to go down to your lens corrections panel, and particularly with wide angle lenses, whether they be a zoom or a fixed wide angle lens, you often get a little bit of chromatic aberration creeping in the corners of an image. And if I zoom up into the top here, you may not see it, but there's a tiny amount of purple fringing appearing along the edges of the highlights. And depending on the type of lens, that could be a little bit more obvious. And if you're going to take the image into Photoshop and do a little bit more color adjustment, if there's a remnant of that color fringing there, it will be highlighted when you start to do further things in Photoshop. So typically I would just about always remove the chromatic aberrations, and you may or may not decide to enable the lens profile. On some lenses it makes a big difference to the image, on others very little. In this one, all it's basically done is remove a little bit of vignetting around the corners, and you can leave that on, and then we might decide that we want to do a few other things later on. So having applied the lens corrections and decided whether we want to do that or not, I often would go down to the effects panel and apply a slight vignette. Now in this case I removed the vignette with the lens profile. I would probably have left that off, but again we have the option of applying a little bit of a soft vignette here. Yes, you can do this in Photoshop, but a little bit of a vignette here doesn't go astray as long as you don't go excessively on it. So that's our 12th step. And going back up to our basic panel, this image doesn't have an issue with haze in it, but if you're photographing a landscape where there's a lot of atmospheric haze, you could use the dehaze slider to remove some of that haze. And you need to use this fairly conservatively because it dramatically increases the contrast and to some degree the color intensity of an image, and it acts a little bit like an excessive contrast tool. This image doesn't require it, but some images would, and so I'd be very careful using the dehaze tool. And our last optional tool that we would have a look at as we quickly work through the initial assessment of the image would be to look at whether there are any dust spots on our image, and we can use the spot removal tool to do this or to assess it. And you can see here that you have the option to visualize spots. In this image it's pretty near impossible to see if there are any spots on the image, and I think there's pretty much nothing that we want to get rid of, but we do have another image that we will have a look at where we can remove the dust spots. So let's go and have a look at that now. So the last thing we'll have a look at in our quick assessment guide for working in Lightroom is to have a look at see if we have any excessive dust spots that we want to get rid of. And I have another image here taken in Western Tasmania in an area that was burnt out by bushfires, and it was taken on quite an overcast day. And of course, any time that you change lenses on your camera, you run the risk of dust getting in and getting onto the sensor, and particularly with mirrorless cameras, they're a little bit more prone to do that. And so where you have areas of blank sky, you can often find that you've got dust spots, and sometimes they don't become obvious until you've gone into Photoshop and done a little bit of extra work building up contrast and adding some texture, and then all of a sudden you find you've got some nasty spots. Now I can see one spot here already, but I'm sure there are more. So if we turn onto our spot removal tool, and having had the visualize spots option turned on, we can see now that we've got a number. Now they're usually pretty easily identified by the fact that you've got this little bit of a circle. So if I hold down my space bar to allow me to zoom in, you can see here that here's a little spot, and there's another one there. And if you're not sure whether that's in fact a spot or not, just turn the visualize spots tool off, and yes, sure enough, there it is, a nasty little dust spot. And we use the spot removal tool to get rid of that. Now I would normally have it on the clone option. You can also choose the heal option, and you can experiment. And you can see here that my tool is not big enough to remove this dust spot, so by using the right square bracket key I can increase the size of that spot removal. And you really just want to go just outside the area of the spot. You don't want to be starting to clone or heal excessively large areas. Click once on that spot, it will find a source area that is similar, and it will repair that for you. Now, so if I just turn that visualize spots option off, we should be able to see that that spot's disappeared. So let's just turn the visualize spots back on. Use the space bar if you wanted to go back to a full view, zoom back out, go back in, space bar to zoom in, spot removal, and zoom back out, and we can go through. Sometimes the screen will take a little while to refresh, but we can go through and pick out all of our dust spots. And if you've got one dust spot on your sensor, you're bound to have more than one, and so it's worthwhile just doing this, because once you've gone into Photoshop it becomes more problematic to do. You might as well do it here where it's quick and easy, and you've got the ability to really clearly see how those dust spots appear. And I think I won't bore you with going through all of these, but Photoshop will choose the nearest tone. If we click back out of that, and often with areas of fairly flat tonal range you won't see those dust spots until you start to add more contrast and other aspects to the image. And of course it's always good to get rid of those dust spots in the field, but you don't always see them until it's too late. So that's our quick start guide to processing images in Lightroom. There are 8 initial and 6 optional steps, and I think that you should be able to go through fairly quickly with an image to do a quick assessment, to decide whether this image is worth spending more time on, to further refine. There are a lot more tools in both Lightroom and Photoshop that we can use to really bring out the best of the image, but these ones will allow you to make that initial assessment of whether it's worth spending more time on. So I hope this has been useful for you. I'll have more videos coming soon, so please come back and see what we've got to offer.